Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about terrorists at home and some recent high-profile arrests. A father and son, Fouad Mustafa El-Didi and his son, Mustafa El-Didi, have been charged with multiple terrorist-related offenses, or allegedly for ISIS, after being arrested by the RCMP at a hotel in Toronto in July. The father is also accused of dismembering an ISIS-held prisoner in a 2015 terrorist propaganda video shot in Iraq. It's unclear if the man in the video was alive or dead. Members of Parliament have voted to probe how the father and son got to Canada. Another deeply troubling case involves a 51-year-old BC woman named Kimberly Polman, who's been charged with terrorism-related offenses after she allegedly traveled to Syria in 2015 to join ISIS. She was brought back to Canada in 2022 from Syria, where she had been held in a detention camp. She was arrested and put on bail conditions, and police investigated her for those terrorism charges. Here today to discuss the troubling trend of terrorists at home are two experts. We're first joined by criminal defense lawyer Ari Goldkind. Ari, thanks so much for joining me today. Let's talk about this father and son duo who've been arrested for terrorism-related charges. What more can you tell me about the case? I know that there's a few details so far, but what do we know?
Christine, it's interesting that the amount of detail that's come to the public is more than you usually see in these kinds of prosecutions, where there's a lot of tight-lipped nature on the part of the police, worrying about state secrets and not encouraging others. Here, the police have revealed that these two people who seem to be located more in the Newmarket area, just outside of the Greater Toronto area, had bought an axe and a machete on a very specific day. They were downtown to commit a terrorist attack as many people as they could get their hands on. The police have been tight-lipped about the exact nature of the target. Let's keep in mind that the father says the son has nothing to do with it. He was barking to a JP the other day, a justice of the peace. The son came into court and said, I didn't have anything to do with it. These are untested charges. But the interesting detail, and I know you're curious about it as I am, is that they say the act was imminent and that these father and son with the same name were arrested at a downtown hotel. I think if we put some pieces together, just like we heard about Vienna and the Taylor Swift concert, which had to be canceled at the last minute, there are some hallmarks here to the immediacy of this to me.
Yeah, so in order to make out these charges, there's a bunch of different charges related to terrorism offenses, but what is the Crown going to need to prove, especially given that the father is claiming that the son is completely unrelated to any of this?
Well, the son is also believed to have bought a weapon on the very same day. We're talking about an axe and a machete. So unless, like George W. Bush, they were going to go out and clear brush in downtown Toronto, I think there's enough to make out an allegation there. And I have to give the benefit of the doubt to police. They don't just go out arresting people for this willy-nilly. Now, a lot of the time, Christine, and you know this as somebody familiar with the courts, when you charge terrorism, you make a mess of it of a prosecution because you make it easier for defense lawyers like me to say this isn't terroristic. This might be mental health. You're making it tougher for the jury. In what we're talking about today, it's very simple. A beheading is an aggravated assault. They haven't charged murder because they don't know that the person was alive at the time. They can charge for acts that take place outside of Canada. And most people don't know how simple the definition in Section 83.01 of the Criminal Code is, which is causing a death, serious bodily harm, endangering a person's life for the following reason. And it's this simple, as it is this simple to prove: for a political, religious, or ideological purpose. That is not confusing.
Yeah, so you're making reference in part there to this disturbing video, the video allegedly from 2015 that I have not watched this video. I've read the reporting on it. Frankly, I'm unable to bring myself to watch something like that. And I
Of
think
course.
many people are in the same position.
Me
Um,
too.
but it features a man dressed in black, and he's wearing an ISIS hat, and he has a sword. And in the video, it cuts to different angles where the man's face, and he has a reddish beard, is briefly visible. And the allegation is that that man, who they can see in certain clips, is Mr. LDD Senior. So what you're saying is that you can charge for offenses that took place outside of of Canada? We've only got 30 seconds. So, but
Yeah, I know we have less than that. Let's come back because the more interesting question is how is he and his son here and how are they citizens? But he's charged two components for the beheading over there and what they were going to do in downtown Toronto here. That's the nature of the two cases.
yeah, let's get to commercial break and then we'll talk about that when we're back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing terrorists at home and the recent arrest of two men in Toronto allegedly for terrorism related offenses. Now, there's two unrelated but both terrorist related charges. One set of charges is against the father and son for what police say it was a plan for an imminent terrorist attack in Toronto with an axe and a machete. And then there's this historic charge that seems to be against the father for a heinous crime that appears to have been committed in Iraq that was featured in a ISIS propaganda video. So, Ari, what do you want to say about how the Crown would pursue charges for that sort of historic video against the father, by the
Well, for
father?
that, it's kind of, yeah, and that's, I get asked this a lot, which is it didn't take place in Canada. How can he be charged here pursuant to the terrorism provisions and other provisions in the criminal code, particularly if you're a citizen of Canada or a permanent resident and you haven't been tried in a court of competent jurisdiction somewhere else in the world? Iraq wouldn't qualify. Australia, Britain, the United States likely would. They have every right to try him here for that, and they should. You add in the fact that he's a citizen, and it just becomes a mind-bogglingly gross political story, which I think is more interesting than the legal story. The prosecution of the downtown Toronto allegations. Look, they're arrested at a hotel. I would think that they were being very carefully watched prior to that arrest. And the first thing I would want to know as a prosecutor or a defense lawyer is what were they arrested with? And there's probably a lot more evidence, wiretaps following that kind of surveillance, but time will tell and that'll play out in the court.
Yeah, so one of the things that you've mentioned here, and that's really troubling to me, and I think really troubling to a lot of people, is that this man, LDD Sr., seems to have immigrated to Canada and obtained citizenship following this 2015 video being published, this video of the dismemberment of an ISIS held prisoner. So I think what a lot of people are asking is how did that happen? How did like an active person who seems to have been involved in terrorism get to Canada and then get approved for citizenship? And what types of guardrails are even in place to protect us from importing terrorists from other countries?
Well, look, I'm going to give an answer that's purely political. My legal hat is off. Why does this surprise anybody? Why does this surprise any honest broker who's watching our immigration system fail from its even stated purposes? The Canadians are waking up to this. Now, while Pierre Poilievre is a very brave politician, even he treats this as the third rail where he can talk about the carbon tax till the cows come home. But when you talk about immigration, you're going to get called a certain name. It usually ends in phobia. If anybody thinks that this father and son are unicorns or outliers, I mean, just yesterday at the top of the headlines, there's a Vancouver pro-Hamas leader who literally celebrates October 7th and the murder, rape, and beheading of Jews openly. Canadian. Just go stand at the airport one day and people open up their eyes. While immigration is important and crucial and it's made Canada the great country that it is over the last 100 years, I mean, look at my last name. I have a family that wasn't let in for 10, 15 years while they were being gassed and put to death, but we seem to be letting into people into Canada that, one, are not making people Canada better, but two, if you dare say anything about it, you're going to be called the most stupid name in history now, which is far right, rather than common sense. So my view of this case is that it's a political story. Everybody will clutch their pearls and go, how about this dad? How about this dad? Rather than going, is dad a unicorn? Or do we maybe have a problem with just too open of a border?
Yeah, I'm curious because we're talking about two separate issues today. One is the importation of this terrorist ideology and the bringing in of people who have clearly seemed to have a very troubling history. Um, And then there's also the radicalization at home. But I think more broadly, I'm interested in how often it is that we're actually seeing terrorist related charges being laid. You say this is being treated like a unicorn, but is it rare to see a terrorism related charge?
I know we're low on time. Two things. Terrorism charges are rare. That's a good thing. But I think they could be much more. There are limited police resources. There are limited wiretaps. Police seem to every night be investigating 10 shootings on the streets of my city. Police resources are only so great. The greatest danger that I see happening here, and this is my point in 5 seconds, is the chilling effect on speech. We just saw it in England this week on a different issue. The more people fear talking about what they're seeing, the more we're going to see more of this.
Ari, thank you so much for coming on.
Always.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing terrorists at home. And we're joined now by Professor Christian Leuprecht. Christian is a professor at the Royal Military College and at Queen's University. Now, Christian, in the last segment, we were discussing the case of a father and son duo arrested in Canada. And that case involves allegedly we imported terrorism. But the case I want to talk about with you is different. It's a case about a woman named Kimberly Polman, who's from British Columbia, and she traveled to Syria to join ISIS. So, this is a 51-year-old woman. She's now been brought back to Canada from Syria, where she was held at a detention camp. But what can you tell me about the background of her case?
Well, so this is generally so what are sometimes known as ISIS brides is a whole sort of separate, interesting area about what motivates people to travel in general abroad, to travel to join extremist organizations with which they sympathize, and then ostensibly very much miscalculating on what they get themselves into. But one thing that we know about these types of individuals, so there's no sort of standardized pattern, but often they're individuals who are in circumstances where they find themselves very difficult to get out of. And so this is sort of a way for them to, so we know this for a number, for instance, of younger women in Europe who come from often very extremely conservative families, who see sort of not much hope or future sort of for themselves. And so this is sort of an escape valve. Now, of course, when you're in your youth, we've you maybe made smarter choices than I did, but as you know, in your youth, we often people make choices that afterwards they figure, maybe I should have chosen otherwise. So when people are older, it's that's a sort of much more a different sort of dimension, I think, to consider as a sort of in her case, because you think people are more mature, they would
Yeah,
make
because in
informed
her case,
decisions,
she
they
was
appreciate
51 years
context.
old. She wasn't, I know there's these British girls, schoolgirls who went to join ISIS allegedly, but Miss Pullman, in her 50s.
Um, so just like Jenny, with so people who sympathize with violent extremism come do so for any host of reasons. And so it's always difficult to guess sort of what ultimately attracts them. But certainly, I think her case is an outlier given her particular age and her particular context, also in a sort of fairly, in a Western sort of progressive, advanced sort of democratic context. But it's often difficult to gauge personal and sort of familial circumstances. But the reminder for us all as Canadians is that ultimately any citizen in Canada risks being attracted to this type of ideology. And so we need to have effective frameworks in place to make sure that we deter people from making these types of decisions, where on the one hand, they are ultimately then shoring up organizations that are engaging in activities and violence that are clearly run counter to Canada's interests, expectations, values, and at the same time, we also to some extent need to protect them from themselves, because it is costing the taxpayer a huge amount of effort and money.
Hmm.
First, of course, then they want to be repatriated. That can often be very difficult. Now we're going to end up having to lay charges. We're going to have to try to prosecute these individuals. So it's ultimately in no one's interest. And in a world where social media is ubiquitous, travel is relatively cheap, this is a phenomenon that I think Canada still needs to think long and hard about. How do we make sure we have effective frameworks in place so we don't get ourselves into this sort of situation in the future?
So I know details in Miss Pullman's case are somewhat sparse, but do we know anything about the allegations about what she did when she was in Syria? I know there were some allegations of some of these ISIS bride women that they participated in ISIS propaganda. Do we know anything about what she did when she was there?
Well, we need to see like what the indictment actually says. So what we think we might know can often differ considerably from the indictments. We also see this with the two individuals who were just charged that you had referred to in the Toronto case, because ultimately the charges that are being laid are laid either because there's a reasonable grounds to believe that you can prosecute and win, or because there's a clear public interest based on the activities sort of engaged, and that the Crown feels it has enough evidence. And these extraterritorial prosecutions or prosecutions for extraterritorial offenses can be extremely complex and difficult for the Crown
Mhm.
to win.
We've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I want to talk about the decision of the government to bring Miss Pullman back to Canada, as well as some of the other women in similar circumstances. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing terrorists at home and the case of a BC woman who allegedly traveled to Syria to join ISIS and has now been repatriated, brought back to Canada, where she's facing terrorism related charges. Now, Christian, the Canadian government repatriated Miss Pullman, as well as some other women in similar circumstances, other so called ISIS brides, but they did not repatriate men who traveled to Syria to join ISIS. And some of the families of these men have they'd actually sued the Canadian government, demanded that they also be repatriated, but their lawsuit failed. The court found there was no constitutional requirement to repatriate. So, did Canada have an obligation to bring these women back? And if not, why did they bring them back?
So there's a couple dimensions to this. One is that this can get really expensive for the government. We know this with the case of Omar Khadr, where of course the government fought for a long time not to have to repatriate him to Canada, and subsequently the government ended up having to pay out a very significant compensation. So one of the ironies is that you might get involved with groups that fundamentally run counter to Canada's interests, and then end up the taxpayer having to foot a significant bill for poor decisions that you might have made under these circumstances. Different governments have taken different approaches to this. European governments have been fairly proactive at bringing their citizens back, and there's basically three types of approaches that people can take. You just simply leave them lingering there. You bring people back and you try to reintegrate and them into society, or you try to prosecute. And so Canada sort of seems to fall in between the two, that uh, in between the three, so that it leaves some people languishing abroad where it feels it doesn't have immediate sort of requirements to do so. It brings some people back and tries to reintegrate them, in particular children. And then, in cases where it feels that there's sufficient evidence that you could possibly mount a successful prosecution, it then tries to lay charges. Um, uh, and the outcome of that, we'll have to see how certain the government is that it can ultimately prosecute, because, of course, it's near impossible to call witnesses and the like, let alone the reliability of witnesses in these circumstances. So we'll have to see how this shakes out.
One of the things that's strange to me is how this type of radicalization is happening in Canada. Why a woman living in a progressive province, a liberal democracy, would go online and learn about an extremist group like ISIS, a violent group that is oppressive to women and all types of minorities and horrifically violent. And what would appeal to someone about them that would make them say, I want to give up what I have here in Canada and go to Syria to join these people? How is that even happening?
Look, it's a great question. We actually have some answers to this. The interesting case on this that's been studied extensively is what's known as the Toronto 18, which, of course, is somewhat of a misnomer, but we'll just kind of leave it sitting at that. Where a number of the individuals had very different motivations, including in one case, love as a motivation. So we know from the radicalization research that there are individual micro level drivers, there are meso sort of level, mid-level drivers, and then there's macro level drivers such as sort of hate for, whatever society or the broader values of Western society and so forth. We also know that there's about 12 of these drivers that they combine differently for different individuals. So it's not like you can just give CSIS an easy checklist, and if you check these 6 checks, then you're at risk of you're particularly at risk or so. So this is a rather sort of complex undertaking. But what's important is that people who sympathize with um, extremist violence aren't always necessarily people who then become violent extremists. So the reason why people sympathize with these organizations and the reason why people engage in violence, often two separate drivers. And just because you sympathize with an organization doesn't necessarily mean you engage in violence. And the people who become violent aren't necessarily people who were obvious sort of sympathizers. To make this even more complicated, in some cases, people more or less radicalize overnight, and in other cases, there's a weeks or months long sort of slow on ramp. So
Mhm.
it is very difficult to generalize, which is what makes this so difficult for security
Right.
intelligence agencies to prevent.
Christian,
Because
that's all the time that we have, but this is so fascinating, and I want to thank you for coming on to share your expertise.
it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
We've heard today about terrorists at home. What do you think is the best path to addressing this serious national security threat? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.